Hello, Jane. It's Mike Whitney here, and I want to introduce you first to everybody who's watching this. Jane Bremmer, you head up Zero Waste Australia, is that right?
That's correct, yep.
And give me some more information on yourself.
Okay, well, I'm based in Western Australia. I've been an environmental health and justice researcher for about 25 years. I started my journey into environmental health and justice from my own experience of living next to WA's worst toxic site, which was a big, huge waste oil dump that propelled me into the world of toxics and environmental justice campaigning. So that was back in 1996. Over those years, I've been assisting many communities all over Australia who face pollution threats.
It's nice to talk to you because that's why I'm involved. Look, they're trying to build an incinerator in a suburb of Sydney called Matraville, which is in the South Sydney end of the eastern suburbs, not too far from the city, maybe 10 kilometres south of the city. And that's where I grew up. And I just can't believe that we're discussing in New South Wales in 2021, building one incinerator. There's 4 planned across the Sydney Basin. I saw on the news only a couple of weeks ago that they were protesting out at Blacktown because they want to build one there as well. And as far as I understand and what I've read, this is just like the most ridiculous idea to try and get rid of our waste. Now, look, I know we were exporting a lot of waste overseas and mainly to China, and that's all stopped now. So the New South Wales government's got all this waste that they don't know what to do with, and they've come up with this idea of burning it in the city. To me, it's a backward step after probably 20 or 30 years that we've tried to clean up that area. And that area where I grew up had the Burrell Oil Refinery, Bunurong Powerhouse, ICI Chemical Factory, which a bloom was discovered, and Chris Hansen, who we're working on this project with, a bloom was discovered under the ground that Chris worked on that, and they're still pumping that out before it gets into Botany Bay, and other related factories and stuff like that around that area. But over the last 20 or 30 years, a lot of those places have gone now, and they've done some remedial cleaning up, and Botany Bay is really, really lovely and pristine. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, we get this information that they want to build an incinerator there. And so the first question I thought was for electricity to run the paper mills down there. Is there any advantage to the community about that? No, we're not even going to get any of the electricity. Nothing at all. So then I started reading about the pollution. And this is what I want to ask you about because I'm not an expert. So look, I've got some questions here, which I think most of the people in the area, the affected area, and then again, that depends on which way the wind's blowing. If it blows that way or that way or that way or that way, this toxic bloom is going to come out of this incinerator and go all over Sydney. So my first question is this: why shouldn't we burn waste for energy?
The short answer is that burning our waste for energy is the most polluting and the most expensive way to make energy and manage waste. So that's the big reason why we shouldn't burn our waste for energy. Burning waste for energy generates comparatively small amounts of energy, takes a lot of energy to run these incinerators. Much of the energy that they do generate gets subsumed back into the process. Incineration originally wasn't built to make energy. Incineration was built primarily through the EU and the US to provide heating. So what we've seen happen in Australia and around the world is increasing pressure to deal with our burgeoning stockpiles of ever-increasing waste that we're generating. When we build an incinerator to burn that waste, what we're doing is we're entrenching a linear system that is essentially unsustainable. So if we go back and look at our waste is a window into our materials production processes, how we make our food, how we make the things that we use and live with every day in our society. And when we look at our waste, we can see where we're going wrong. We can see that we're producing materials that can't be reused, can't be composted, and can't be recycled. And we're talking about predominantly non-recyclable single-use plastics. Now, that is the section of the waste stream that is predominantly going to feed an incinerator. It's the plastic fuel feedstocks, because plastic is a fossil fuel. So it's attractive to a whole range of combustion industries, pulp mills, like cement kilns, like brickworks, anywhere where there's a combustion engine, component of that industry, is looking to burn waste now. And that's because in Australia, pretty much every state has passed waste policies, zero waste to landfill. Really solid, has been a national policy and has been implemented across the states for the last 10 years. Unfortunately, although that's a good policy, there's been no setup to deal with the fact of what happens when we don't send our waste to landfill. So we don't have the systems to create clean waste streams that will support a recycling industry. We don't have the systems to protect the resources so that we can reuse that waste. We're not separating our waste, although it's happening, taking all the organics out and getting that into composting. When you do that, when you take all the organic waste out of our municipal solid waste stream, when you take all the recyclables out of our municipal solid waste stream and all the things we can reuse, what you're left with is what's called residual waste. And this is the waste that's destined for incinerators. And it's predominantly non-recyclable single-use plastics. It's the smallest fraction of our waste stream. And yet here we are building the most expensive and most polluting technology to deal with the smallest fraction of our waste stream. It makes no sense. It makes no sense economically. And that's why these industries have to rely on renewable energy and clean energy subsidies from the government to be a viable industry. And that's a crime in itself, because burning non-recyclable single-use plastics in incinerators, or burning waste in general in incinerators, doesn't produce renewable energy. It's not a clean technology, and it's not a renewable energy technology. And it's stealing scarce money from bona fide renewable energy technologies like wind, solar, wave, all the other new great bona fide renewable energy technologies that we should be supporting instead. So it makes no sense on any level to build waste incinerators. It's bad for the climate. It's particularly bad for the local communities who carry the disproportionate pollution burdens. We're talking about incinerators leaving a very documented pollution footprint, about 10 kilometres around each plant. These are the communities' burden of that waste disposal technology for the rest of society. Yet it's entrenching the very kind of system we're supposedly be trying to move away from, which is a circular economy. Incinerators entrench linear economies, and that's why we should not be supporting them.
I've read some material that says no matter how good the filtering is on top of that stack, that funnel where it will come out, there's almost minute, minuscule particles, dioxins and all these sort of things that get into the food chain, that get into the water, whatever. I mean, isn't that enough of a reason to say that this project at Matriville is a really, really bad idea?
Absolutely, because the most expensive component of any incinerator is the air pollution control units to catch the deadly pollution that comes from them. Persistent organic pollutants, which are internationally recognised. They're the subject of the Stockholm Convention, which Australia is a signatory to, this international convention, to eliminate all sources and generation of persistent organic pollutants and unintentional generation of persistent organic pollutants that happen through incineration. So there's two ways these persistent organic pollutants happen in incinerators. They can be generated through the feedstock, inherent in the feedstock, because we're not separating our waste properly. We're burning mixed plastics. We don't know what's in that plastic. It could contain, it only needs to contain polyvinyl chloride, which is a common plastic. You're generating dioxins. You've also got the issue of the de novo synthesis. When the gases come out of the stack and they start to cool down at temperatures, they form in the atmosphere dioxins as well. So this has been well documented in China, in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands, where they're taking a very close look at the best practice EU incinerators. What they're finding is dioxin in the surrounding environment, in the chicken's eggs, in the cow's milk, in the grass that those farm animals are eating. It's an environmental pollution that's getting into the food chain. They are forever chemicals. They don't go away. Botany Bay's close to the ocean, I believe. So you can expect these kinds of pollutants to land in the ocean and poison the marine food chain, as well as landing in people's backyards, landing in their rainwater tanks, in their gardens where their chickens will pick it up. They will get those persistent organic pollutants through the eggs, through the meat if they eat.
And then that ends up in our system, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So that's persistent organic pollutants. What we do know is that incinerators also emit significant amounts of particulates. And look, the pollution profile that comes out of an incinerator is only as good as the air pollution control unit that captures it. And air pollution control units, they don't run at 100% efficiency 100% of the time, because they need cleaning. They get clogged up. It's just like a filter in your vacuum cleaner or your washing machine or your whatever. You have to clean it regularly to keep it operating. That means that there are moments where there is a startup and shutdown and bypass events. So what the
no filter.
Absolutely. And that's where it only takes one bypass event from the air pollution control filter to emit a year's worth of their regulated and legal limits for that pollution. And we know that incinerators on average have about 12 bypass events in a year. That explains why the deposition in the surrounding environment is being picked up, because the industry, the incinerator companies, we're operating to our legal, we average our emissions, we provide our regulatory reports to the regulator. Thing looks great on paper, but they're not monitoring and accounting for the bypass events, which are significant pollution events, and that's just the bypass events. Then the other risk for incinerators is they're very prone to catching fire, exploding. There's numerous examples all over Europe, the constant fires and explosions and accidents and bypass events. They're a dangerous industry. They're not a safe, benign industry. They're a combustion process, and they're using a highly complex fuel feedstock. So they're inherently a hazardous industry. They shouldn't be located anywhere within 10 kilometres of residential areas or anywhere where there's a groundwater or drinking water body close to the ocean or wherever food is grown. Essentially, there's no place for this dead-end industry in Australia anymore, because we know that Europe is decommissioning them and moving away from them. They've recognised the danger to human health. They've recognised the inherent undermining of the recycling and the zero waste policy that is the backbone of a circular economy. They've recognised that that's undermined all more sustainable waste management technologies and principles higher up the waste hierarchy, like avoiding, reusing, composting, recycling. All of those are undermined by incinerators.
Jane, if they're starting to phase them out in Europe, why are we even entertaining the idea of starting this up in Australia? Are we that far behind in our mentality?
Look, I think they're valid questions to ask our politicians and our government regulators. Why on earth we would be wanting to pursue a technology that's in decline? I think you could ask the same question about LNG. We're facing catastrophic climate tipping points. we can't burn our way out of climate change, whether it's with LNG, whether it's waste incinerators, whether it's fracking. They are all essentially fossil fuel based burning industries. We can't, the planet cannot afford that anymore. So it's a seductive idea for governments to think, well, we'll just set up this technology, we'll hide all of our waste, hide all the problem. We've said that we're not going to export to China anymore. One magic box will just fix everything, but it doesn't. It doesn't stop waste to landfill. In fact, it just turns that waste toxic, hazardous ash, because there's a huge generation of ash associated with the waste incineration industry. It's a far more problematic solid waste to be managing. It will have to go to hazardous waste landfills. We're at a vulnerable time too in Australia, where we're desperate for good news stories about waste. We're desperate to have fantastic recycling schemes. And some of that wants to use the fly ash and the bottom ash from the incineration process in our building and construction materials. This is how we poison the circular economy. So we really have to get our policy position right in the first place, and the federal government hasn't got it right? Because rather than speaking to the zero waste experts, they're speaking to the waste disposal industry, the incinerators, the global waste corporations that dominate the world, Suez, Veolia, Acciona. These are the global waste corporation companies that are here in Australia managing our waste and have got the ear of our government and are designing our policies. Until we start to take the issue of sustainable waste management seriously and start to talk to zero waste experts instead of the waste disposal sector, we're going to have this captured regulatory process. And I can't reiterate this enough, because what we're seeing in Victoria is the industry getting a foothold and not even being afforded a proper environmental impact assessment process. Nowhere in the world does that happen. And yet here in Victoria, the government is willing to establish an incineration industry without full environmental impact assessment. It's a scandal. So the east coast of Australia, all of Australia, is really under siege from this dirty, polluting technology industry at the moment. So communities like yours are fighting really hard, not for your own benefit alone, but for the broader principle of clean air for everybody, safe oceans and sustainable economies. I mean, always frontline communities carry the fight, but they're carrying it for everybody. And it's about time the broader environment movement and the broad political representatives in those frontline communities really step up and speak out.
I can't believe some of the things you just said, Jane. I mean, it's like we've got our head stuck in the sand here and have no information. And I would imagine that these incinerators have been in Europe long enough so that we've collected a lot of information about the damage and what's going on there. So I'm sure everybody wants to hear, this is question number 3. What are the alternatives?
Mm-hmm. So the alternatives exist. They're being practiced all over the world, and it's simple. We have to honour the waste hierarchy, which puts prevention and avoidance and reduction at the top end. We have to look at zero waste city models. They're being implemented across the world. Comparable cities, the size and same kind of demographic as Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Brisbane, Adelaide.
Can you explain what zero waste is?
Yeah, so zero waste is looking at our waste management system and designing waste out of the system rather than dealing with waste when it becomes waste at the back end. So we've written to the government over 20 years, encouraging them to adopt a zero waste policy. And what that does, it says, let's take all of our organic waste out of the municipal waste stream. because organic waste has no place in a landfill or an incinerator. That's the material that generates methane, which is very potent, which is why we shouldn't be putting our waste in landfill with mixed waste. It generates methane and makes a dirty, toxic, polluting mess. So we need to take all that organic waste out of the waste stream and compost it, because goodness knows our biosphere needs that soil organic carbon. But to do that, we've got to really keep clean waste streams. So the first principle of a zero waste policy is in source separation and collection. If you get your collection and source separation right, you generate clean waste streams. So let's not mix the organic waste stream with bits of plastic, with other things. Let's keep it clean. In Western Australia, we have what's called a FOGO system, a food and organics. It's being rolled out across Australia. It's the most important thing because it takes nearly 50% of our municipal solid waste stream out of the waste stream and puts it into use. You can even make energy from it. If you want to put that organic waste into an anaerobic digester, you can make compost and energy. Secondly, we have to make sure we're separate as we possibly can all of the recyclable streams. So the system we have now where a truck comes around to people's houses, it picks up the mixed waste recycling bin that's got glass, it's got paper, it's got cardboard, it's got plastic, it's got everything in it, chucks it into the back of the truck, and the truck compresses it. So there you've lost a lot of the recyclable value. You've smashed the glass, you've contaminated the cardboard and the paper. So we're heading in the right direction by separating our recyclable waste, but we've got to be smarter about it and invest in better collection and source separation systems, because when you create nice clean cardboard and paper streams, nice clean glass streams, you can do more with those things. There's more of a market. What China and Southeast Asia said to us is, we don't want your dirty mixed plastic waste anymore because it can't be recycled. So we need to acknowledge that in Australia and separate our waste streams better. That means we might need to find a better way to collect cardboard and paper. We might need to separate the glass from that waste stream. We might need to separate perhaps even different types of plastic. But the more effort we put in at that front end, the smaller the residual waste stream is. And the residual waste stream is what's destined for disposal, landfill or incineration.
If we got that down very well, what percentage would end up as a residual waste? Would it be just 5 or 10% or?
We should in Australia be able to get our residual waste stream down to about 10%.
Yeah.
If we do things like recognise that a big chunk of our residual waste is nappies and sanitary products, right? Really problematic waste stream. It doesn't need to go to landfill, and it certainly doesn't need to go in incinerator because it's full of PVC chemicals and things that generate really deadly pollution. So there are technologies like, I'm a big fan of the Sanitec unit. It's an autoclaving and shredding unit. It can take medical waste, nappies, sanitary products. It autoclaves and sterilizes that waste and then shreds it. Then you can do something with it. It's not going to generate methane in a landfill. It's not going to be of any use feeding it into an incinerator. We could find another use for it. We should separate that out. But the most important part of a zero waste policy is to set up all of the community benefits, repair and repair stores, recovery centres, where people can donate their used goods. We need to be married with strong extended producer responsibility legislation, container deposit schemes, all of these things that support the separation of this waste and the recovery of it. So, you know, we can tie an organic system to a community garden that grows food for local people. We can tie it to a recovery centre that repairs electronics and sells them cheaply or gives them away to people. And so all the time you're substituting people having to buy new products, furniture, all those kinds of things. Huge social investment, 200 times more jobs in the zero waste sector than there are in the incineration sector. 200 times more jobs. This is where the social investment is. This is where the jobs are. This is where the clean, sustainable, recyclable feedstocks come from. That's the model. Part of that, though, the really important part is for us to establish a residual waste research centre. We cannot just continue to hide this residual waste stream in a hole, in a combustion furnace. We have to look at it and say, okay, this is what represents the problems in our society. This is the waste we can't reuse, compost, recycle. We can't do anything with it. We need to solve this. And that's where we need scientists in the community and regulators to come together, look at our residual waste stream and work out how we're going to eliminate it, redesign better. So that's a simplistic view of a zero waste policy, but it's the backbone of a circular economy because it provides the feedstocks that go into a circular economy. It provides the jobs, it provides the social investment. It provides the backbone of a sustainable society. It is such a critical issue. It really is a fundamental part of the entire climate change movement because our unsustainable lifestyles, the waste we generate, they're all destroying finite resources, and we have to change the way we live. We have to change the way we manage our waste and change the way we make and live with things. And to do that, we need to implement zero waste policy and move to a circular economy.
I can't understand why the federal government and state governments don't understand what you just told me. Is it about changing their mindset? Because they will say, oh, we've always done it this way. We've always mined for gas, we've mined for oil, and we burnt this and we burnt that. Is it the fact that there may be major investment at the start of a zero waste policy, maybe even billions and billions of dollars? But once you've got that set up, then you talk about this circular economy, which will just keep revolving on itself and producing jobs and recycling and putting stuff back into and money into the community and stop polluting. I mean, why would the government hesitate at all to be involved in something like that?
I think that the only conclusion we can come to is to recognise the power and reach of the fossil fuel industry in Australia. Let's not forget that plastic.
It's all about the money, Jane, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Look, the fossil fuel industry is facing the end of fossil fuels. You know, that's where the world is headed. They're very, and some would say, and I would say, more powerful arm of the fossil fuel industry is their petrochemical arm. So petrochemicals are what makes plastics, makes all the industrial chemicals, the pesticides, the paints, the cosmetics, the food additives. The petrochemical arm of the fossil fuel industry is what provides the feedstock predominantly for our materials production processes. They are looking to increase because their other arm of fossil fuels is in decline. I think that's what's going on at the moment, and that's why we're seeing a global push for new waste to energy technologies. One of the other things that's going on is that the industry, because of that predominance of the fossil fuel industry in Australia and our extractive cultures and our jobs and economies that have relied on that, particularly in Western Australia and particularly in places like, you know, the Hunter Valley, all those coal counties which are facing these kinds of proposals. It's easy to consider that that's a pushback from the decline in fossil fuels. But what also is happening at the same time is, and it happens very much in the waste sector, capturing the narrative. All of a sudden in Australia, at odds to the EU and many countries around the world, and we're seeing industry and government start to talk about waste to energy incineration being part of a circular economy. This is a key indication of the degree of industrial capture, because I can't understand when all the evidence is there and it's placed before the decision makers and these communities, we still have to deal with circular economy discussions in government and academia that include waste to energy incineration. I'm making this point because it's very serious. And Australians really need to wake up to it and recognise that some of our academia is captured by these fossil fuel industries. Our regulators, many of our regulators and governments are captured by this industry. It's important because in Europe, they're legislating to remove renewable energy and clean energy subsidies for the industry. They're enshrining in their legislation that waste incineration is a threat to the circular economy. They've just recently announced in EU legislation that waste incineration is a threat to the pandemic recovery. So Australia's position is extremely at odds with the direction that Europe is heading, and yet we claim to be a smart, innovative country, and yet we're ignoring some really basic principles. And the first one is technologies that dispose of the resource are linear, essentially linear. To deny that is illogical and just can't be supported. So wherever we see these new circular economy hubs and narratives that are rolling out across Australia, and we see the inclusion of waste to energy, we know that that process has been captured already.
What we've talked about Europe, I mean, surely there's incinerators in America, possibly in the UK as well. What are the other countries doing?
Look, the US has had a long history of incineration, and their incinerators are very old and they're pretty much all being shut down.
Yep.
San Francisco is different states in the US do different things. You know, some states are using Sanitec units to deal with their residual waste, that autoclave and shredding. Some are still relying on landfill, some are relying on incineration. But what I can say in the US is the big incinerators are predominantly sited in lower socioeconomic and predominantly Black communities. And that's in recognition.
Why does that not surprise me?
Of course, because they're highly polluting industries, and that's where governments put them. If you put, there's going to be less resistance, and that is just been the way that industry has rolled out across the world. And you know, we could talk about colonialist governments and their exploitation of communities and countries the world over, but that's pretty much the situation in the US. They're in predominantly lower socioeconomic and Black communities. The other thing in the US is there's some shining examples like San Francisco that is really leading in zero waste policies. So that's the US. The Asia Pacific region has really just been the dumping ground for Australia and most OECD countries, and yet we're willing to point the finger at these countries for the global plastic marine pollution. It's a heartbreaking crime because while these OECD countries are happily burning their waste and dumping in the Southeast Asia region, they want to now go in and build incinerators in those countries. It will be an absolute climate disaster. So it's not a popular technology around the world. It's going through a bit of a resurgence now, and that's as a knee-jerk reaction to the shutting of the waste dumping that's happening in the Asia Pacific region. And we're seeing a lot of greenwash. Incinerated technologies that are claiming not to be incineration. Pyrolysis and gasification is two that come to mind heavily in Australia. And we're seeing academics and industry partner and push these technologies and try and claim that they're not incineration because it's more you know, incineration has a bad name. No one wants to live near an incinerator. You know, Sydney banned incinerators when, in the 70s or 80s? You know, long time ago. Backyard incinerators were shut down in the 80s. Medical waste incinerators at hospitals were shut down because, you know, we recognised how toxic and polluting and harmful to human health they were. So we have to, frontline communities like yours and many across the East Coast and all around Australia, really have to guard against the greenwash that's coming out about, firstly, that pyrolysis and gasification incinerators are not incinerators. Secondly, that incineration is clean, renewable, and part of a circular economy. These are nasty greenwashing agendas that are confusing the public and are used to get approval for their projects when there really is no social license for any of these industries in Australia.
Jane, that's probably my last question is all of that, what you just said. What should we do next?
Well, as a frontline community, your priority is to protect your community's health and viability. That's the most important thing. These frontline campaigns are the backbone of a much larger environmental justice, global environmental justice movement. And although I know it can seem to be a lonely place in Australia fighting these campaigns, I can tell you that there's a very solid international movement behind you, ready to support you. So we need to fight these projects in the trenches, on the ground. That means we have to go in there and do all the soul-sucking environmental impact assessment process, the lobbying, the community raising, the hard grunt of fighting these projects. Then we have to join forces with other communities around Australia who are facing the same fight for support and for collaboration and for camaraderie, because God knows we need that. That's where organisations like I come in to help communities like you provide the resources and the networking with other groups. So we have to fight it in the trenches. We have to then go to the national level, and we have to demand that our federal government stops handing out renewable energy and clean energy funds to this industry in Australia, because it's giving them a leg up with money they're not entitled to. So we need legislative change. That would be a top priority for me this year. But we also need to challenge academia and regulators and governments and well-meaning environmental communities, the groups that have been misled. So we have to fight it in the trenches. We have to educate the broader community. We have to challenge our legislators to not provide the incentives for the industry to establish. And we need to get them instead to move away from that to zero waste city models to support a circular economy. That is a big job. And that is the most important aspect of challenging these industries and technologies. And that's where all the hard work is. But on a personal level, every single person can change their own lifestyles to stop using single-use plastics, to separate the waste, to write to their local MPs. People can feel empowered and take action at a personal level too. But for those that want permanent change and faster, we have to have an organised, grassroots, national and international campaign, all working together and supporting each other to make the deep changes we need. And that has to happen at the highest legislative level. We have to end those subsidies. We have to implement full extended producer responsibility laws. We have to ban and get rid of single-use non-recyclable plastics. It's a no-brainer. Some of these things are happening, but I'm a bit disappointed to see that Susan Lay's plastics agenda and waste agenda doesn't really go far enough. And what we are facing in Australia right now is a boom in plastic reprocessing facilities that will take all this non-recyclable plastic waste that we've been sending to Asia, and instead we're going to pelletize it, flock it, shred it, and continue exporting, and more worryingly, export it within our own country to be burnt in cement kilns and other industrial furnaces. So we've got our work cut out for us, but I think we're in a good place. But first and foremost, you've got to defend your own community and take on the fight that is the environmental approvals process. And that's a big, hard job, but we're here to help you.
Wow, that's a lot of information, Jane. Thank you very much for all of that. I really appreciate your time. Jane Bremmer, Head of Zero Waste Australia, thanks very much for today.
My pleasure. Thanks for interviewing me.